I'm sorry, right off the top, can you tell us how much more we added to reserves in this year compared to the prior year?
So 2020 to 2019.
Yeah.
Look real quick.
Total, right?
That's one thing that it's always difficult to see what the beginning balance was at 2019. What's the beginning balance in 2000?
Sure, it was right under 4 million was the delta from 19 to 20.
Okay. Thank you.
You bet. I won't spend a lot of time giving background information, but just give the committee just a reminder in terms of the types of restrictions that can be placed on reserves. I'll talk about 4 of them. There's actually 5, but you're going to see 4 different designations as we go through the worksheet. The first is a restricted reserve. This is a reserve that is restricted due to, like, say, a constitutional provision, maybe LMC, or maybe a contract such with an external party. Committed reserves is what we're going to focus on today. These are reserves that have constraints placed on them by the highest level of decision making in our local government, which of course is the city council. Then we have assigned reserves. These are reserves that are assigned for a specific purpose. Historically, the council has delegated that authority to the city manager and finance director. That allows us flexibility to react during, like mid-year. And as the mayor pointed out, we don't actually know our total additions to fund balance until about March of the next year. So that does give us the flexibility to assign specific reserves without taking council action as more information comes available. And then the final is unassigned fund balance, which is basically everything else. These are fund balances, don't have any restrictions on them at all. It could be used for any purpose. The committed reserves, just a few points for the committee to keep in mind as we discuss these. Again, these are fund balances that are constraints placed on the highest decision making in the organization. The council historically has taken formal action in terms of an ordinance. So the goal here is to eventually get before the council to pass an ordinance establishing the reserves. This is really a financial reporting issue. Obviously, we want to take direction from council in terms of making sure priorities are met and planned for, but we take this official action so that accounting staff know how to report these fund balances on financial statements. In order for us to have the most up-to-date information from council, this ordinance has to be adopted by December 31st of the reporting year, which of course is coming up here in the next month. And I would point out that it's a common question, and it has to do with the budget versus these committed reserves. And the question is, well, the council adopts the budget, isn't that good enough in terms of establishing reserves? And it's actually not. So the best practice or the guidance from our accounting boards state that you do need to take this separate official action. I did mention earlier that assigned reserves, in the past, the council has delegated that to the city manager and finance director, and we would, of course, recommend the council do the same with this next ordinance. So let me bring up the worksheet that I hope will look familiar to you. Okay, hopefully you could see the spreadsheet on screen. So these reserves really focus on the general fund and general government services. So this doesn't include utilities. It does not include our internal service funds. So it's really just our general government funds. Just to kind of give you a little orientation, of course, you have the 3 most current years. In terms of 2021, since we don't know that ending fund balance at this point, we simply carried forward the 2020 year end. So that's why you're seeing no change from 2020 to 21. As you know, we collect, as an example, sales tax 2 months in arrears. So we actually won't know the year-end sales tax collections until the end of February. So it's, obviously hard to account for those funds when we don't actually have them in hand and know what that amount is. You have in this column here, this is the current classification. So this represents the committee reserves that council took action on last year at the end of 2020. Also includes any assigned balances that the city manager and myself assigned based on what we heard from council in terms of priorities. And then the far right column is what we propose for the committee and the council to consider. I'll focus my comments on things that have changed rather than things that have stayed the same. To give you kind of a guide on the color coding, this orange or peach color, it isn't really a change, but it's just a highlight that we are planning to use those reserves in the adopted 2022 budget. So really for informational purposes, I highlighted the actual changes for the committee and council to consider in the green color here. So again, I'll just kind of focus on the things that I've highlighted. And obviously, if you see anything that catches your eye, I'd be happy to answer any questions on things that I don't make comments on. So the first one is the Criminal Justice City Assistance Fund. So this was a action that the legislature took earlier this year, which provided Lacey $216,342 really for criminal justice reform, other types of requirements that have been imposed on local government law enforcement. So we are planning to use this restricted fund for the body cameras that are going to go forward in 2022. City Hall Reserve, it's currently $1 million. We are going to spend about $177,000 in 2022 on an elevator repair here in City Hall and some LED lighting improvements. Strategic investment, this has been a really big focus of the council. In 2021, the budget does include $200,000 for a springboard partnership with St. Martin's University. I'm not sure what the status is of that project. It will either be spent or carried forward into 2022. In the 2022 budget or proposed budget that the council will be considering here in a couple of days does include $300,000 total for economic development and strategic investment. $150,000 is really just a holding place for economic development opportunities that might arise in 2022. There's also $150,000 for improvements to the food truck site there by the depot trail amenity. So when everything moves around throughout 2021 and 22, the end of 2022, we expect to have the $2.5 million in total reserve, which has been the council's target. So you have 2.8 total by the time the council, if the council takes action to commit the funds as proposed, and then we'll have that $300,000 that will be spent in 2022. The police station is also a reserve that is got quite a bit of movement. Of course, the council amended the 2021 budget in the amount of $3 million just to position ourselves to take advantage of the opportunity to buy property. So that is in the budget, so it doesn't need to be committed. So that leaves a remainder of $1.1 million as of today. And then we are including $400,000 for the continuation of that police station expansion project in the amount of $400,000. The succession planning for police, this of course is the plan to help us bridge the gap between retirements and bringing on new police officers. As you know, there's a long lead time in between hiring a police officer and when they're actually on the street serving the public. So we're aware and actually in the midst of a retirement wave in the police department. So and seeing that and knowing that was going to happen, we wanted to make sure we were able to maintain service levels. So we do have 3 extra positions currently in the police department for this 3 to 4 year period. So that amount is originally it was 2 million. We're using 399,000 in the current year budget. The 2022 budget includes about $434,000 for that program. Jail services is a reserve that we put in place a couple of years ago. We had a little bit of unknown in terms of what jail services were going to do at the time. Wanted to make sure that we were in a position to obviously maintain that important need for the budget. We have since negotiated contracts, and that's a stable position now. So we want to uncommit that essentially, and that's going into unassigned fund balance that will be used to help balance next year's budget. Security cameras, this has been a multi-year project throughout the city in terms of city facilities and parks. So this has been, like I said, a reserve that we've identified a number of years ago. The 2022 budget does include about $154,000 of this reserve being used. The water assurance fee, we're basically asking the council to uncommit those funds. This, of course, is the septic to sewer funding that we identified, I think, 3 years ago. Of course, the council directed staff and the rate consultant to include that in the current rates, which we did, and the council adopted at your last council meeting. The mobile outreach team, we identified 3 years worth of funding for this important community resource. We're just continuing that program. 2021, of course, it went into effect. So we're using a little bit of money in 2021. We plan to continue that into 2022. It's currently an assigned reserve, and we'd like the council to commit those funds. The next 3 are reserves that were assigned, but we would like the council to commit those. So we've identified funds for future mental health and drug addiction services, some sort of partnership, probably a nonprofit out in the community for this community need. We want to be prepared for the return to normal. We certainly expect we will be returning hopefully sometime in the near future to in-person meetings, but we do need to have a virtual option for folks. I think we've identified that as a real benefit to our community in terms of availability of council meetings. So we have $100,000 as a placeholder in case there needs to be some sort of equipment investment. And then we had identified $500,000 in terms of capital replacement. You might remember, I think it was 2 years ago, we used to include in the budget basically a funded reserve for this, and we took that out of the budget for budget balancing purposes. So we would like to fund that, continue to fund that reserve. The next section, again, is a series of assigned balances that we would like the council to commit. The first is a reserve for our employees, essentially. So it's the continues the city's ability to provide remote work options for employees as we navigate the COVID pandemic. And we do have $650,000 for the Oxford House model. Of course, you just discussed that during your legislative discussion at last week's council meeting. So this is a little bit of, in terms of operational costs as well as capital in the event that the city is not successful in receiving state funds for that project. Body-worn cameras, of course, we've had lots of discussion about that through the budget process. We have a $600,000 reserve for that initial capital investment. We do have $125,000 in hopefully in a committed reserve for the community service officer staffing that's in the 2022 budget. A very recent notification from our partnership for our records management system. Of course, this is a record system that the local jurisdictions partner in. This is a police issue. So that system is slated for replacement in 2023, and Lacey's estimated share is $475,000. We just want to be in position for that. I do want to highlight a couple placeholder items for the committee and the council. This would be a really good example of how having the flexibility of having the city manager and finance director have the authorization to assign reserves. Obviously, we've been talking about the Great Cuyo Park Master Plan. We're obviously thinking about the future and potential investment into that asset here. So we think that's a top priority of the council. So that would be an area we would identify as assigning reserves as a top priority. The other issue is our building permit revenue surplus. This is a upcoming project. We really need to take a look and evaluate kind of probably the last 5 to 10 years of permit revenue versus the actual cost. So there's RCW that limits the use of permit revenues for the cost of service, basically to provide that service. So think inspection, think of design review, that type of thing. So we just need to make sure we do an evaluation to see if there is a surplus, because it will need to be restricted in terms of its use in the future.
So what are you thinking for the Great Cuyo master plan? I mean, it's blank. So are you thinking about filling in the number once the reserve balance comes in March?
That plus, as you know, the council continues its discussions with the community in terms of what the priorities are, I think it'll self-identify, I think. So yeah, obviously we need to have reserves available. So that's one issue, but really we need to kind of finish off that discussion and implementation and adoption of that plan. And I think that will identify, and obviously council will, and the Parks Commission will play a huge role in identifying, what may actually move forward. So again, I think it'll self-identify what that amount is.
We should also get some preliminary cost estimates, I think, early next year as we finalize the master planning process.
Yeah, I mean, that is important. I mean, it's a big project for our community. Our community is really excited about it. It'd be nice to be able to commit some reserves to that for sure.
Yeah, definitely. The next three are really just informational. These are the uses of these reserves that are in the proposed budget. So the Parks and Rec comp plan priorities, it's the outdoor ping pong tables, the RAC long-term financial plan. So last year, I think it was last year, maybe it was the year before or late in 2019 or 20, I mean, the council committed $800,000 for 4 years worth of extra support for the RAC as we develop that long-term financial plan. And then we have $260,000 for the climate action implementation in 2022.
So quick question, do you think that 260,000 will be carried over again as you spend it, then we would recommit some for say like 2023 as well, or how is that the assumption?
Yeah, that's probably, this is going to be an ongoing issue. So yeah, I think it would probably fall under the same as the Great Cuyo Park, kind of a city manager, finance director action as we see how things move forward. There's the phase 4 of the plan that's going to be worked on next year, and I think that will also identify the needs and where the plan may go. So yeah, certainly we see that as a council priority.
Yeah, I mean, all of our talks have been around setting up grant programs for the community for energy efficiency projects, so on and so forth. So I think we're going to have a committed fund to do that going forward. I'm not sure what that number should be. I mean, that might even be a little on the low side, but I do think this is going to be ongoing projects that we're going to be doing in our community for quite some time. So
Yeah.
it's something to be thinking about, that we need an ongoing committed reserve for that.
Also, I have a couple other questions. So one, where do you think the funds will come from the Greg Cuyo master plan? As we get, so my assumption is as we get assigned something and utilize that, then that won't be plugged in. It could be plugged in at Greg Cuyo stuff. I mean, I'm just saying, since it's blank, where are we getting, where do we get the funds to plug in there?
Yeah, we'll look at what's available after the 2021 year closes. I think we'll be adding to the reserve. It's just a matter of how much.
Okay.
It's just an unknown number now, just because we don't actually know what our year-end revenues and expenditures are at this point. But
don't you have a pretty good idea? I mean, there's 4 million, going into for 2020. Our revenues have been way over our projections, so it's got to be at least 4 million again.
Yeah, we're currently sitting in terms of cash flow. It's about 1.8 million surplus.
Okay.
There's some moving parts in there too, with the ARPA funds are sitting in there. So I'm trying to account for that too. I mean, those obviously have a restriction in terms of the use of that. But yeah, there's basically 3 months left in the sales tax year. Like I said, we won't actually know we'll continue to receive that sales tax for 2021 through February. So yeah, I mean, obviously I've never made promises to the council about what that number will be. I'm not about to do that now.
That's just fine. So here's another quick question. The Oxford House, okay, we've committed there, but so that is for that one specific model. Do we need to have some other kind of committed funds for additional affordable housing, even though we know we're using ARPA funds, et cetera? Do we need some kind of placeholder for additional funding for purchasing things or whatever we do?
That's a good question. We had committed reserves for the Northeastern public schools. Remember the housing for, and we've never been able to spend that. I don't see that here.
Yeah.
So we do have another letter of commitment with Homes First, so that is in place still. So there is an expectation that those funds will be committed either late this year, or early next year. So that project is finalized. We did give $250,000 to the school district in relation to their family and children's support center. The Oxford House is another program, but you're right. The majority, if we're going to make a significant impact on affordable housing, it's really that $4.6 million investment with ARPA. And the Oxford one is trying to figure out, can we find a partnership and maybe find a model that can actually work, and we can demonstrate to the public that this is maybe a path forward.
So where was those Northeastern public schools reserves?
Uh,
I think they've been expended by now, right?
It has. I did a quick look, and of course, being under pressure, I didn't see it right away.
Yeah.
It might be in our building fund. It'll.
Because was it 250,000?
I think that is correct.
Well, that's a good memory if you know the actual amounts.
Well, we were working on it, and we thought we had a plan ready to go and property ready to go, and we can never get it to work.
Well, there's two things. So there was the help with the school district. Again, that was the family and the children's sports center. But then it was 150 for Homes First, and that was a partnership to do 4 adult teens into housing.
Oh,
And as you
that's right.
recall, that ran into so many roadblocks with prevailing wage. We were going to build at one point, and that became cost prohibitive. So now we've decided to hopefully just secure and buy a home.
Okay. And that's in our next year's budget?
So it's been in carryover for about the last 3.
Continue to carry that over as a committed reserve.
Correct. So you'd see it come forward in like our budget amendment in, early next year if it hasn't been spent yet.
Okay. And as Homes First actually identified a home?
I think they're working on it. They were still trying to secure the $250,000 from the state legislature because that was a grant, if you recall, that was supposed to combine our monies. I think they now have secured that process. Now it's just a matter of then going out and finding a property.
Okay. Okay.
I probably shrunk down the details to, if it ended up being zeros in the line item, I shrunk it down so it didn't take up space. But yeah, I think what the city manager relayed.
So there is that holding for the future affordable housing. Okay, good.
Well, I just plugged that in for you.
Oh,
so-
you just put it in there. Okay, good.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's smart. We've been talking about that for a long time, and it'd be nice to commit some reserve for
This is a good example of staff listening to council.
that. That's a good recommendation, Deputy Mayor.
Thanks. Okay. Then I feel pretty good about it. And I'm glad we can say that we could carry over the energy efficiency stuff too,
Yeah.
even though we don't know what we'll do for 2023, but still.
Yeah, I agree.
Moving on to a different fund. So this is the Criminal Justice Fund. This is the countywide sales tax for criminal justice. Really, the only changes here are related to the police station expansion. So we have another $2 million being budgeted in 2022 to continue that project. There's a little bit here in terms of police labor, $400,000. So not a lot of change within this fund. Community buildings, the only really just a note that we're going to use some of the building repair reserve for LED improvements, as well as some repairs to the Jacob Smith house, the gutters and the roof. The RAC M&O budget basically added a little bit to the field replacement reserve. City streets, the only change we're asking the council to consider is committing instead of assigning the reserve for future facility improvements and expansion.
So I know that's also been a part of the discussion over at the Great Cuyo site on the other side of the road. Is that what you're thinking about? Well, I guess that's for public works, right? Not
correct. It's kind of one and the same. I mean, streets is definitely a part of that. I don't think we have a specific plan. I mean, this is really just thinking about the future. That's definitely, as you know, the site, current site is restricted. And we're obviously a growing city, so it's really just identifying that kind of far future potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a good location over there. I think we definitely need some expansion on that side of the freeway, so it makes sense. And so I know there's a lot on the plate, but it makes sense to be able to look at this fund to be able to do something over there.
Yep, that's a good point. The last of the general fund funds is capital equipment, mostly informational. We're doing a little bit of work on the Wonderwood Park Trail and basketball court, really just repairs. You can see here we're continuing with the security cameras as we talked a little bit earlier. Do want to point out a change in the RAC reserves. We, as you know, we're going to do the rack parking lot expansion or improvements.
Mhm.
And really that's going to be a shift from field replacement reserves into parking lot reserves. And that's for the
So
general.
I see the PEG fees with nothing no longer there. Is that because it's no longer in the contract?
No, it's because we've spent more than we've collected in PEG fees. So it's sitting at zero. I do expect we'll add somewhere in the neighborhood of 35, 40,000 for 2021. Again, it's a timing issue. Council actually doesn't have to take action on that because, as you pointed out, that's a contract issue. So it will automatically be restricted when we actually determine what that number is.
That reminds me, what's the future when it comes to that? I mean, it still feels like the community's sort of hasn't made a decision if we're going to continue to use TCTV and if we do go in a different direction, is there going to be additional costs? Are you preparing for that, Troy, or is that on your mind?
So we are still in the discussions with TCTV and also our partners. And at some point, there's going to be a request for proposals to see what does that look like going on beyond really 2022. That's when our contract ends. So that is on our radar.
Yeah, I mean, there may be an additional cost there. Who knows? I mean, the PEG fees might not be able to cover that.
Well, we need to be careful given, I mean, as it's pointed out, restricted, the PEG fees are only for specific upgrades. So you're right, that is something we're going to have to look at, and that's part of the whole proposal process.
We're touch on some of our other funds. Not a lot of change in this area. Our trail streets and transportation improvement fund, those are all restricted funds. There's no action needed of the council, but really you could see the health of these funds. Transportation improvement fund, as you know, and through the budget process, we're scheduled to do about 4.5 million, 4.75 when you include sidewalks in 2022. And that's really, as you know, we were looking at a $2.5 million annual overlay program. Just because of these reserves, we're able to increase that in 2022. No change in lodging tax, still have to the dollar, basically no change in 2021. Building improvements, we're going to, in 2022, we have $300,000 for a facility assessment and software purchase. This is really to track the condition of our facilities, so we could better plan for scheduled maintenance and repairs. I do want to point out public art. That's been a topic of a lot of discussion with the council. You're seeing a decrease in 2020 to 21. Of course, the council committed $30,000 to the Gold Star Memorial. We are, actually this should say committed. We'd like the council to commit the 2021 contribution. So again, that's the dollar per capita. So at the end of 2021, we expect to have about $251,000 in total for public art, which it's really nice timing with your discussion about our public art plan.
I would love to see us do something really fun in public art. I mean, I like the memorial, but that's a pretty serious art project. It'd be have something that is just kind of feels like you can smile at it.
Yeah. Well, there's a big art. I mean, they're working on the plan right now, and I think there's some really cool stuff in it. Can't wait to sort of get an update on that. I'm sure we're gonna hear about that plan early next year sometime, right, Scott?
Actually, it's going to go before the next council meeting. You'll have your 6-year plan.
Oh, perfect.
Excellent.
There you go.
Good.
And there's a little bit of public art in the lodging tax budget as well in terms of banners. So yeah, a lot of movement in this area, which is great. Parks and Open Space Fund, no changes within this fund. The Regional Athletic Complex, the RAC capital side, again, related to the parking lot. So moving from field replacement into parking lot construction. That is everything in terms of the reserves. Be glad to answer any questions, or if there's any other direction you would like us to take. And we are scheduled to have a full council discussion at a work session following the next count. Is it the second? Yeah, so it's Thursday. We'll have this similar conversation at a work session with full council, and we would hope that from that we would move on to a ordinance for the council before the end of the year.
Sounds good. Can you just send that to this committee, that document?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You don't need action to send this to full council, right? It goes automatically.
Correct. Yeah, the next thing will just be another discussion. So.
Great. Any other discussion?
No.
Okay, then let's go to the third quarter financial report.
Okay, so you have in your packet the latest quarterly report. In terms of expenditures, we've expended right at $36 million in the general fund. It's about 65% of the adopted budget. It's a decrease actually of about 1.9 compared to last year. The major differences between this year and last year we were spending a lot of CARES Act monies. We had our small business grants that were going out, so just a very different year. But when you do kind of look at the details, I would point out that the general fund has spent about $900,000 more in labor. Some of that is just filling of vacant positions, but we also do have some inflationary increases related to labor. We'll bring up the details of the expenditure report. Share screen here. Okay, hopefully you can see the detailed report. I won't go through every line, but I do want to point out some of the items for the council. The first is within contracted services. We're showing a decrease of about $179,000. That's really related to jail, district court. I mean, if you think about what's been happening with COVID, and those are just areas that we haven't seen a lot of activity just because of restricted use in terms of the court system, that sort of thing. So it's definitely a temporary decrease. If you look at social services, a $1.6 million increase, that's almost entirely related to the improvements we made at the Veteran Services Hub. We had so far year to date, about $1.6 million in improvements there. The next one is under parks maintenance, $392,000 increase. The majority of this is a water billing error. It's about a $205,000 billing error. That's since been fixed, so that's essentially not a significant variance. Community and economic development, showing a decrease of $207,000 from this year compared to last year. This is also related to the CARES Act. We had about $185,000 spent in terms of economic development out of this department budget. Transfers out, obviously a huge variance, but again, that's related to, a lot of that's related to the CARES Act. Basically transfers into other funds in order to get that money out into the community. If you look at combination of this, criminal justice, $543,000 and the $244,000 in police, I mean, that's almost entirely labor and technology investments for the police department.
Could I ask you a really stupid question? Well, it's not stupid, but it's weird. So that correction for an error, that won't show up in our auditing. I mean, because we caught it in time, correct?
Oh, yeah, it won't be an audit issue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to ask that question, but it just
No,
dawned on
no.
me.
Yeah, it definitely could be if we hadn't made the correction, for sure.
Okay.
Community buildings is showing a $538,000 decrease. That's related to the 2020 HVAC repair. So as a one-time capital project in 2020. Capital equipment fund, we just had lower levels of capital in the 2021 budget so far. The remainder of the funds pretty much as expected. In terms of utilities, a lot of these differences are timing issues in terms of transfers, primarily the transfers from the operating fund to the capital funds are the main differences there in expenditures. But overall, we're spending as expected in the through the third quarter at least. So I'll kind of switch gears and talk about revenues. So general fund revenues, we've collected just under 43 million, about 77%. Pretty big increases, but primarily related to the American Rescue Plan Act, the first distribution of $3.4 million. So we're about 2.9 higher than last year at this time, but again, it's kind of offset by that $3.4 million received from the American Rescue Plan Act.
That reminds me, I really haven't seen where the ARPA funds are in any of this. Where do you have it? And that's obviously a committed fund, right? Or is it?
It's a restricted fund, and to make it even more confusing, because that's what accountants do. It's actually not a revenue yet, just because from a grant perspective, it's not considered a revenue until you spend it. So it's actually a deferred revenue, but I could definitely show you where that sits. It's right here in other grants. Of this 3.7 million, about 3.4 is the ARPA monies, but that's very likely not to show up. As we head to year end, we'll make adjustments, and like I said, it won't be it actually will be likely a 2022 revenue as we start to spend those funds.
That only reflects half of what we received so far too.
That's correct. So we'll receive that second distribution probably in June.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to be about 12 months after the first distribution. That's a nice segue into the details of revenues. Property taxes are about $380,000 higher. We certainly expected an increase just because of the new construction credits and the 1% increase. But I think we talked a bit about this during the mid-year report. I think this is higher than expected, or at least as a timing issue, because of all the housing sale activity. So when houses are sold and transferred to new owners, those property taxes are paid, and they're basically prorated between the buyer and seller. So they're paid at the time of sale rather than end of May, end of October. So that, I think, has certainly been happening through the first half of the year. Sales tax, we've had a lot of discussion. Obviously, you see the monthly emails that I send out where in the 13-14% higher than last year. Just about every category is experiencing growth due to the recovery from the kind of forced reduction in activity because of COVID. General merchandise is up about 11%. That's our biggest sales tax category, but I will point out the construction is down about 31%. Not a surprise. I mean, we obviously watch building permit activities, so we know know about what it will happen in the next 2 years. Bno taxes are up as well. Bno tax for the most part follows the same trend lines as sales tax, but one difference I think in Bno tax from this year compared to last year is the service industry. That was professional services, personal services, repairs, and those sort of things that happen at people's homes really stopped in 2020 because of COVID. So that's coming back in 2021. Utility tax as a whole is up about 370,000. The main reasons are electricity and our city-owned utilities. I will point out that the telephone utility tax continues to drop. That's just been a trend for the last 5-6 years. There's been actually some accounting changes within that industry as well, and how the telephone company report their revenues. We talked about the ARPA monies. Do want to point out, talking about sales tax and new construction, building permit revenues are down so far in 2021. We're down, I think it's about 120,000 in building permit revenues. Let me go back. I want to highlight emissions tax. It's only showing about a $40,000 decrease, but that doesn't really tell the full story because 2020 was a really down year for admissions tax as well. So really, we're collecting about 10% of what we would normally collect in admissions tax. Gambling tax, very similar story to admissions tax. But gambling tax is faring a little bit better than admissions tax so far. We are seeing parks and recreation coming back. As you know, we're trying to provide this valuable service to the community. Again, very similar to admissions tax, gambling tax. While it's showing an increase, we certainly have not returned to the pre-pandemic levels in terms of that activity. But as I stated during one of the budget hearings, we have a lot of optimism in this area that we're going to return to normal. The last thing I want to highlight is interest. We've talked about this a great deal as well. Interest rates, overnight rates are basically zero. So that's, we went from about a 2% rate down to zero in about a 4-week span in 2020. So no surprise that we're seeing interest revenues with a significant decrease. I will say we are doing, better than I would have expected, just because of our long-term investments and our investment strategies there. And obviously this committee reviews that 2 times a year, and I think that's really helped a great deal. Again, looking at utilities, coming in as expected. The biggest variance is in sewer. A lot of that is lot, as well as our rate increases as well. So, but again, coming in pretty much as expected in terms of revenues.
Just a quick question. Why would the Hicks Lake be a deficit? I would think that would be just a steady payment or a steady thing, simply because it's the fee is designated.
Yeah, that's likely a timing issue. So Hicks Lake is an assessment through the property tax bill. Those are very, very stable.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm not alarmed at all by that.
I mean, it's a small amount, but I just was curious why it was down. Okay.
Does that also gets paid along with your property taxes, right?
That's correct.
Oh, okay.
So does that, if a property sells, do they have to pay it at the time the property sells too, just like the rest of property tax?
You know, I'm not sure. I would assume so. I just don't know if, you know, the management district assessment has the same lien authority as property tax. But yeah, I'm not exactly positive on that. So that's, you know, those are the details of the report. I won't go into the forecast. In fact, I was very, very short and brief in the staff report. You know, we've had a lot of that discussion through the budget process. But, you know, obviously the pandemic is still on our minds and there's still some uncertainty around that. So, you know, I think we've done a really good job in terms of looking forward and budgeting and planning in terms of reserves to be able to handle that. I mean, I think it's, you know, a testament to the council and our fiscal policies that have really helped us get through this without really having to decrease services that we provide. So overall, good report, I think.
Great. Any questions?
Mm-mm.
And with that, we reached the end of our agenda. Without objection, I'll call this meeting adjourned.
Thanks. See you in a minute, Lenny.